Hey everyone, I'm Allison Mars. You're watching NBC News Now. President Biden and Vice President Harris in Atlanta today, visiting the CDC. That agency issuing some new guidance today on social distancing, specifically for schools. The president talking about keeping up the pace of vaccinations in this country now that we've hit 100 million shots in just 58 days.
We hope we can keep the pace about 2.5 million a day, which would mean that we may be able to get to maybe able to double it, but we've met the goal and we're continuing to move forward.
Biden and Harris also meeting with Asian American community leaders in Georgia after the fatal shooting spree there this week. Their top concern, the rising violence against Asian Americans in the last year. We'll have more on that later this hour. For now, let's bring in NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba. She is in Washington, D.C. Monica, we know the president's meeting with Asian American community leaders at Emory University this evening. What do you expect to hear from him there?
Well, the visit is really twofold, Allison, in that he is going to both consult the Asian American community and then also console them, of course, for the horrific violence that we saw there this week. And the original intent of this trip was a completely different one. The president and the vice president were going to be down in Atlanta, Georgia, really having more of a political focus, particularly on the American Rescue Plan and what's in that COVID relief bill. But when all of this happened midweek, they decided to completely scratch that and then make sure that the focus of the visit would actually be what happened there. So then they're going to meet privately behind the scenes with some leaders and community groups, specifically from the Asian American community, of course. But then the president is also going to have these larger remarks that aren't just aimed at the immediate community and people there who are affected by this, but also to the nation, speaking about how the White House is very closely tracking these continued incidences of violence and discrimination against Asian Americans. So he's going to be combining all of that. And then the vice president will be speaking as well at Emory University. But this was also a very busy, jam-packed schedule because while they were there, they also made a stop at the CDC, which is, of course, headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. Allison.
And a real important visit for the vice president as well. We know for the first time in American history, we have an Asian American female VP. Let's talk about how important President Harris's words are right now at a time like this.
Incredibly significant. You are absolutely right. To have her voice is very important here, according to experts in the community who want to hear what she has to say. We heard a bit of a preview of what she was going to be talking about earlier when she was at the CDC and wanted to make sure that she delivered a message both on behalf of her and the president, which is that you are being heard in terms of the Asian community that, again, is jarred from all of that's happened, even though we don't have a clear enough or clear-cut motive from the person who committed these heinous acts. So the vice president making clear on that, and the president echoing that, saying that we're not just here to thank CDC workers, we're here to also, of course, talk about why people might be feeling particularly vulnerable right now, given these acts of violence. But the president tied those two things together when he was speaking at the CDC earlier this afternoon. Take a listen to that.
We can build all the walls we want. We can have the most powerful armies in the world. But we cannot stop. We cannot stop these viruses, other than be aware where they are and move quickly on them when we find them.
One thing that the president was warned about in this CDC briefing is the fact that some of these variants have shown that actually they are resistant to certain therapeutic treatments, those monoclonal antibody treatments they give to people once they're already infected with coronavirus. So that was a new development there. But the president was very quick to point out that doesn't mean that the vaccines wouldn't work against these strains, something else that they wanted to highlight as a part of their visit there to the CDC today. Allison.
As we know, the CDC cut its social distancing guidelines in schools today. What other updates on COVID did the CDC give the president and the vice president, Monica?
They specifically said that they were encouraged by an overall trend downwards of cases, of hospitalizations and deaths, but they did warn that there was a slight uptick recently, and that's something that makes people like Dr. Anthony Fauci or Dr. Rochelle Walensky a little bit nervous, because they're saying if some states really ease up on their restrictions too soon, there could be the potential here for a fourth surge. So while you have the president and the vice president extremely optimistic about the pace massive vaccinations. Obviously, that 100 million shots in arms goal met 6 weeks earlier than they even anticipated this year. They're still a little bit nervous, and that's why the overall message right now is, yes, we have things to look forward to, the 4th of July, if everything goes according to plan, but this is the time for optimism and not the time for full-on relaxation quite yet, Allison.
Monica, the Biden administration also trying to manage some clashes with Russia and China. Let's talk Russia first. Recalling its ambassador after Biden called Putin a killer. How would you describe the Biden administration's relationship with Vladimir Putin right now?
To put it simply, 2 words. It's complicated. There are a lot of layers to this. This is something where we haven't just seen a war of words between the 2 leaders now, but you even have President Putin trying to invite President Biden to have a live debate. That's something that the White House said, OK, we'll take that under consideration, but it doesn't seem like that's going to be likely anytime soon. But earlier today, the president was asked, as he did leave for that trip to Georgia, whether he would consider talking to Putin again soon. And he said, I'm sure we'll talk sometime in the near future. Of course, we know they had this lengthy conversation in late January after the president took office. The 2 leaders remain engaged on a variety of topics, and further sanctions are on the table for Russia in terms of not just the SolarWinds hack, but also other ongoing election interference. We know from a report that was declassified just this week that President Putin was the one who authorized those efforts to intervene and try to really thwart Joe Biden's candidacy. So all of that is still being considered, but the president also wanted to be sure to point out that there are areas of mutual interest in which he wants to continue to work with Russia. So it's really a parallel strategy at this time.
All right, so let's talk China. Yesterday, Secretary of State Blinken had a pretty contentious meeting with some top diplomats from China. Tell us what happened.
This was unbelievable. This was really supposed to just be a really quick photo spray of the 2 sides coming together to kick off these talks. And instead, it turned into something of about an hour and a half of the 2 sides going back and forth. Of course, you have to allow for translation with something like this, too. So that was part of why it took so long. But essentially, when the U.S. opened with their remarks, the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, there as well, they did call out China for human rights abuses and in other ways. So then China responded saying they wanted to defend themselves at length, and this just went on and on and on. The talks are scheduled to conclude today in Alaska, Allison, but absolutely a fiery exchange and one that continued on for a substantial amount of time.
Yeah, Monica, that was some photo op, Monica Alba at the White House. Thank you so much. 3 feet is the new 6 feet in schools. The CDC updating its social distancing guidelines, saying that students can now be just 3 feet apart, but only if masks are on. Here's Dr. Rochelle Walensky at today's White House COVID briefing.
Last week, the journal Clinical Infectious Diseases published a study that looked at COVID-19 in 251 Massachusetts school districts over a 4-month period of time. It found that physical distancing of at least 3 feet between students could safely be adopted in school settings when everyone, students and staff, wore a mask at all times.
NBC News correspondent Heidi Prisbilla joins me now from Watertown, Massachusetts. Heidi, the CDC based its decision on a study of Massachusetts schools. It found no real statistical difference between 3 feet and 6 feet of social distance in terms of spreading COVID. Could you tell us more about that study and these new guidelines that came from it?
Right. 3 feet will apply to elementary school students, Allison, under all circumstances, no matter the level of spread and transmission in the community. But for middle schoolers and high schoolers, they did bump it up to 6 feet when there is high community transmission. Allison, this is a big development here for Massachusetts and states around the country because one of the biggest obstacles to reopening schools fully has been that 6-foot rule. Why? Because they simply don't have the physical space. It would have been very expensive to build on space versus using that money for other mitigation measures. And so school administrators are very happy about this. They say that they are already starting here in Massachusetts. I talked to the commissioner of schools. They're already starting to renegotiate with some of the teachers unions that had cut deals, and some 400 districts here of varying degrees based on 3 feet, 6 feet. They're going to try and get them all down to 3 feet, Allison. So a big change from just a few weeks ago.
So it is a big change, Heidi. What are educators saying about it? How are they reacting?
Well, there's mixed feelings here because they say that these studies assume that you have all of these other mitigation strategies in place. And it's not clear, for instance, that all teachers are going to be vaccinated as well. And certainly the Biden administration has said that they don't need to be vaccinated. But the teachers and teachers union that I talked to here said that this is a concern for them, that they're really going to have to make sure that every single one of these measures is in place in order to feel safe. Take a listen to what the head of the teachers union had to say.
We are going to have to now figure out, in the light of reducing the distance, how to ensure we're still keeping everybody safe. It's too soon. We need the first shot in every educator's arm, and we need to make sure that ventilation systems, distancing, and testing are firmly in place.
So, Allison, this is particularly important as we see these new, more contagious variants spreading. And certainly school children do not suffer the same symptoms as adults do when they get COVID, but they can be asymptomatic vectors. And that is a concern for teachers if they are coming back into these buildings unvaccinated.
Heidi, 79% of K through 12 parents support in-person learning. That's according to a recent Gallup poll. But I know Mary also talked to you about concerns that Latinx and Asian families have about sending kids back to school. What else did she tell you in that conversation?
She talks specifically about this study out of Massachusetts, Allison, because she made a very important point, which is that the study did not say that there is no difference in risk between 3 feet and 6 feet. It just said that they couldn't capture a statistical difference. And she said, look, let's be honest about this debate. We're talking about a risk assessment here. We're weighing this against the risks to students of at-home learning, which other studies are showing have very negative impact, for instance, on physical and mental well-being. But those risks and that assessment, it's not the same for every family. Take a listen to what she had to say.
The conversation now is beginning to shift to the level of risk we're willing to assume. National surveys and statewide surveys show particularly Black, Latinx, and Asian families are not willing to assume the same level of risk that these experts who are recommending 3 feet are willing to assume.
Allison, the change in the guidance isn't going to change things overnight here in Massachusetts or in other states because there are already agreements and guidelines that have been cut based on the 6-foot rule. And so the teachers here tell me that now they're going to start to renegotiate these, and it may give them the extra weeks that they need in order to get teachers vaccinated, which is really the main concern here and the main ask on behalf of teachers.
Yeah. I know that's a concern there and in so many other school districts across the country. Heidi, thanks so much for your reporting. Joining me now, Dr. Bob Lahita, chairman of the Department of Medicine at St. Joseph's Healthcare System. Dr. Lahita, we are so happy to see you and your bow tie on a Friday. We were hoping for that here at News Now. It always brightens our day. What do you think about these new CDC guidelines? Is 3 feet enough distance to keep kids and teachers safe?
Well, based on the fact, Allison, that you've heard there's a lot of controversy here. The WHO is now saying 3 feet is fine if the children are masked. I really think, and what I've heard over the past several months, is that teachers are concerned because they are dealing with potential vectors of infection in these little kids. The kids don't get sick as a rule. I mean, we're talking elementary school children. But these teachers are at risk because many of them are over the age of 50. And of course, I realize their concern and they need to be immunized. I don't understand why President Biden said that they didn't have to be immunized. I would presume that the teachers should all be immunized, much like healthcare workers, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in a minute. But this is a big concern. As long as mitigation and good airflow occurs, I think that 3 feet, based on all that I've seen with the Massachusetts study and the Journal of Infectious Disease study and data, that 3 feet is probably going to be good for elementary school children. And by the way, Allison, vaccination is coming to children shortly. Moderna's got a big clinical trial going out with several thousands of elementary school children and also teenagers.
So remind our viewers and explain this, if you will. Why is there a difference between the distance for kids, younger children, and the distance for adults? Why should grown-ups still be staying 6 feet apart?
Well, it is really true that children can be vectors. They can be infected and no one may know it because they may be asymptomatic. They simply handle the coronavirus in a very good way and do not get sick, with very rare exceptions, that multi-system inflammatory disease being one of them. But that's very, very rare. Teenagers are another story. Teenagers are approaching adulthood. They have different kinds of immune systems. They're maturing a little more. They are also vectors of infection, not likely to get very, very sick if infected with COVID-19. Adults, on the other hand, are very, very susceptible. So the teachers have been saying, if we're in classrooms and we don't keep social distancing and we don't wear a mask, and by the way, we've often said this, Allison, together, that elementary school children like kindergartners, first graders are not likely to wear masks very long and very effectively. So that's a concern, that it's going to be difficult to mitigate little children, little kids with the virus. And certainly teachers are concerned that they're appearing in front of a classroom, say, of 30 children, and that's a big item. They are at risk of being infected. I can understand the teachers' union's concerns.
Absolutely. Dr. Lahita, we did get some good news out of Iowa today. For the first time in a year, the state's Department of Public Health reporting 0 COVID outbreaks in long-term care facilities. 14% of Iowa is vaccinated. Governor Kim Reynolds saying more than 90% of nursing home residents are vaccinated. What do those numbers tell you?
Well, any nursing home that's immunized, over 70% of its occupants, is considered a non-worried or non-at-risk group of people. And that is terrific, because with continuing mitigation, that's wearing masks, washing your hands, and keeping distances, the distances can go away if you're vaccinated. And children can come in and hug their parents. Grandchildren can see their grandparents. This is really very, very exciting. They said 90% of residents are immunized and 60% of healthcare workers in those skilled nursing facilities are immunized. And that's really good news. And that has resulted in a significant downtick in the infections in the nursing homes. Remember, over 5,600 Iowans have been killed by this disease. And this is really, really terrific. This is the first nursing home population I've heard of that doesn't have significant clusters and outbreaks.
Dr. Lahita, one last quick question for you. We were touching on this earlier before, but more than 4 in 20 healthcare workers still have not been vaccinated. That's according to a new Washington Post Kaiser Family Foundation. What are your concerns about so many frontline workers still not getting the vaccine?
I'm very concerned about that, Allison. I think I find it hard to believe that, and I looked at a number of studies where 15%, which is a round number, of all healthcare workers refuse to get vaccinated. And it's 24% of them are concerned about safety. And this really mirrors the general population. But I would think that healthcare workers would have better sense than this and realize that they, of all people, are around infected COVID-19 patients all day long and should be vaccinated. 24% were concerned about the safety of the vaccine. 16% were concerned that the approval of the vaccine happened too quickly. And I really think that they need to be educated on this. And by the way, there's a shift among the healthcare workers of certain ethnic groups like Latinx and African Americans, largely because in that population, the incidence of bad news there is almost twice what it is in the rest of the population. So they, among all people, should be vaccinated before the Caucasians, for example. But they are at great risk, and I'm very concerned, Allison.
Dr. Lahita, it is always a pleasure to see you. We're grateful for your medical expertise and advice, and as I said, and for the bow tie. It always brightens our day.
Thank you, Allison.
Time to check in with NBC News Now correspondent Simone Boyce. She has the latest headlines from NBCnews.com. Happy Friday to you, Simone.
Hey, Allison, let's start this Friday edition of Headlines with the latest news on the Myanmar crisis. The Indonesian president, Joko Widodo, is condemning the violence there today. He said he'd immediately call the chairman of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and ask for a meeting. The 10 countries in ASEAN usually don't comment on member country issues, but the crisis in Myanmar could actually change that. And over in Taiwan, the island's defense ministry says China is deploying long-range missiles to block allies from helping if there's a war. They claim China is also using psychological warfare and that China constantly conducts military drills near its waters and airspace, as well as misinformation campaigns to damage the people's faith in Taiwan. Now, China hasn't commented on those allegations. Well, Greta Thunberg protesting with a, quote, "no more empty promises" banner in Stockholm today. Since COVID restrictions aren't lifted in Sweden, protesters came in shifts to the Fridays for the Future protest. The activists demanding leaders sign a binding annual short-term carbon emission target and not, quote, more meaningless goals for 2050. Well, the judge in the trial of the former police officer charged with George Floyd's death is refusing to move or delay the trial. The defense has said the timing of the $27 million settlement was unfair. Judge Cahill, however, will allow the defense to use limited evidence of a 2019 arrest only as it relates to Floyd's death in 2020. And yesterday, I promised that we would have more space news for you here on NBC News Now. And I don't lie, NASA completed a successful rocket test that could land us back on the moon in a few years. The Boeing-made rocket is part of the Artemis missions, and the goal is to have U.S. astronauts on the moon by 2024. But the ambitious project is 3 years behind schedule and almost $3 billion over budget. You know what I say, Allison? Hey, what's $3 billion if it gets us to the moon?
I mean, come on. It's pocket change when we're talking about space. And Simone, you never lie. You always provide fabulous space content for us. And for that, we are very grateful.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Momentum fading for Congress to create a bipartisan 9/11 style commission to look into the January 6th riots. Republican Senator Roy Blunt telling NBC News his instinct is that it's not happening. And congressional aides say private discussions between party leaders have stalled. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Leanne Caldwell joining me now. Leanne, when lawmakers first proposed this idea of a bipartisan 9/11 style commission last month, there really seemed to be some support for it. What has changed since then?
There really was. There seemed to be a lot of momentum. But what's happened is that, like everything on Capitol Hill, January 6th itself has also become very political, too. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said on Morning Joe earlier this week that the challenge that remains in discussions with this commission is the scope of it. She wants it to look into white supremacy and extremist groups involved in January 6th. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has said on the floor of the Senate recently that if she wants the scope to be that broad, then it should also look into all extremist groups. And he specifically named Antifa. But the reality is that negotiations and discussions between the four congressional leaders on this have been stalemated, and it's unclear on how that logjam is going to break, Allison.
Leanne, let's talk immigration. The House passed 2 immigration bills last night with more Republican support than we expected. These bills create a pathway to citizenship or legal status for millions of undocumented immigrants. Both of them now head to the Senate. What are you expecting there? Could there be some surprise Republican support in the Senate, too?
It's not looking like that. The top Republican who has been most vocally supportive of the DREAM Act, ag worker bills, and some sort of path to legalization for undocumented immigrants is Republican Senator Lindsey Graham. And he has said over the past week that he doesn't see how there can be any chance that any legislation regarding immigration passes the Senate while the challenges, the crisis, whatever word you want to use, is happening at the border. And until the Biden administration gets that under control, the Senate Republicans are really responding to that border crisis by resisting working on any sort of immigration bill in the Senate. So it's going to be a very tough slog for any immigration to pass while the chaos is still happening at the border, Allison.
Leanne, a former lobbyist is accusing New York Republican Congressman Tom Reed of sexual misconduct, according to a report from the Washington Post. What else can you tell us about that allegation, and how is the congressman responding?
Well, NBC News has not verified this report, but according to the Washington Post, a former lobbyist was at a dinner with the New York congressman and where he was visibly intoxicated and he inappropriately touched her, putting his hand underneath her blouse. And he is responding. He did respond to NBC News, a spokesperson, saying that his memory and recollection of what happened that night is different than hers. But Representative Reed is someone who has spoken out against Governor Cuomo of New York. He has called for Cuomo to resign, and he has also floated the possibility that he will run for governor of New York. So these allegations, while not confirmed by NBC News, are a big stain and could be very problematic for the congressman moving forward. Allison.
All right, Leanne Caldwell, thank you so much. President Biden might keep U.S. troops in Afghanistan until November instead of withdrawing them by the May 1st deadline. NBC News global security reporter Dan DeLuce has more.
Well, thanks, Allison. The options that are before the president now include the possibility of keeping U.S. troops in Afghanistan beyond May 1st for a defined period of time that could be up to 6 months through November. And the idea would be that by keeping troops there would give more time to a big diplomatic push to try to create a peace agreement or a peace deal of some kind between the Taliban and the Afghan government to try to get a ceasefire, and that perhaps in that time that whole peace process would gain traction. And of course, Biden is no stranger to this issue. He faced an internal debate when he was vice president under the Obama administration, and that was a time when he was arguing against sending more troops to Afghanistan. And we're told that he has great misgivings about an open-ended commitment in Afghanistan, but there's also a risk that if the U.S. pulls out, the Taliban could try to topple the Afghan government, and there could be a revival of the terrorist threat from al-Qaeda. It was the whole rationale for sending American troops there in the first place.
They call themselves the Comms Moms, three of President Biden's top female advisors. Yesterday, they talked with NBC News senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson about stimulus, taxes, and the American family. Today, they get into the filibuster and giving Trump vaccine credit. Here's more of their conversation.
Hey, the president is obviously on the road this week, down the road, selling this American Rescue Plan to Americans. There are other things that you want to accomplish with Congress. That could be hard given the filibuster. Kate, be clear. How far is the president willing to go? Specifically, would he be comfortable rolling back that 60 vote threshold?
Well, what the president is not willing to do, Hallie, is to allow progress and to allow benefits to the American people to be held hostage in the process. And so there are going to be conversations. There are going to be conversations. And he's open to hearing different ideas. At the end of the day, his goal is to ensure that we can get things done for the American people. And he's open to a discussion about what that looks like.
So it sounds like what I'm hearing you say is the door is not shut for the potential for the president to throw his weight and throw his support behind eliminating that 60 vote threshold. Is that fair?
He said many times that that's not his preference. That's not his preference. But he is interested in the conversations that are happening. There are a lot of different ideas out there. He, again, as you said yesterday, signaled his openness to reverting to the talking filibuster. So he's open to the conversation. His preference is to continue to work in a bipartisan manner because he thinks that we're stronger and we're better served when we're coming together and working across the aisle. That's always going to be a preference, but he's open to ideas, and we'll see how that conversation develops.
One of the areas that I've been reporting on a lot is the child tax credit. And advocates, the projections say that, Jen, it's going to lift something like nearly half of the kids in poverty right now out of poverty. How much muscle is President Biden willing to put behind making sure that this tax credit becomes permanent next year in a midterm year when he may have other issues and other priorities on his plate?
A lot of muscle. And that's because he believes that the child tax credit is one of the reasons he wanted to have it in the package. Is a way that can help families, working moms. I mean, we all know, and you know, and you've covered this, Hallie, the impact of the pandemic on so many working moms out there who have pulled themselves out of the workforce, who have taken a step back from their career ladders and trajectories. And he recognizes, and the vice president has done a lot of work on this as well, that this is one of the ways that he can help bring relief to some of these families. So we don't know what the vehicle will be quite yet, But this is something he talked about, of course, on the campaign trail. And he certainly wants to find a way to make sure this relief is permanent and helping working moms and families and working dads as well down the road.
Corinne, Jen makes the point there is more work to be done, talking about, for example, the women that are now out of the workforce. I think one of the most recent projections was something like 2.3 million women, according to the National Women's Law Center, have actually left the workforce since the start of this pandemic.
No, you're right, Hallie. Look, we've been through a hard time. The American people this past year have lost so much, whether it's the pandemic, and then you have the economic crisis, both compounded together. And, we've lost, as you mentioned, women in the workforce. But I just want to go back to the American Rescue Plan, because there's so much there in that piece of law that really helps so many. That's going to help so many families. If you think about even the black family, the black communities who faced the brunt of this pandemic and economic crisis. You think about the 34%. It's going to reduce 34% of poverty when you look at black families and so many other families across the country.
Your predecessors also had children and were working women in the White House who had kids. And when you look at the Trump administration, and when you look at where we are now in the fight against COVID, do you anticipate the president giving his predecessor some more credit on that front, if you will, for getting this country to where we are at this point?
Well, he actually gave the scientists and the medical experts who were under the purview of the Trump administration a great deal of credit, and did throughout when there were developments that were announced during the transition. I think it's hard to know and hard to tell what the impact will be of President Trump coming out earlier this week and, saying that people should take the vaccine. By all means, he thinks, I talked to him about this on the trip, that's a good thing. It's not unhelpful. We don't know what the impact will be. It's hard to measure. But this should not.
You and him were happy to hear that from former President Trump.
Sure. But, we don't know what the impact will be, right? Because what we've seen in our data is it's not even President Biden and former President Trump. It is medical experts, doctors, civic leaders, clergy, others who people know in their communities. If everybody's held hands and said, kumbaya, everybody take the vaccine, it's safe, it's effective, that's great. But there's also lots of tactics and strategies we have to use here to make it happen.
I mean, he believes they deserve representation. That's why he supports D.C. statehood.
The push for D.C. statehood picking up steam with support from President Biden and a hearing Monday in Congress. NBC News political correspondent Ali Vitale has the story.
The fight for D.C. statehood is personal for 22-year-old Jamal Holtz.
I am a native Washingtonian.
Holtz and his colleagues at 51 for 51, a statehood advocacy group, spent the last 2 years organizing on the road, educating voters and candidates alike about how D.C.'s nearly 700,000 residents, the majority of whom are black and brown, pay federal taxes but lack representation in Congress.
I noticed whenever I was like, call your senators and advocate on the Hill, that my advocacy ended at the mayor's office.
At the start of the pandemic, that left the nation's capital shortchanged, getting less cash from Congress in the first round of COVID stimulus, despite paying more in taxes than 21 states and the most per person in the country. It also lacks control of its own National Guard, a danger highlighted by Black Lives Matter protests last summer. And on January 6th, as a deadly insurrection broke out on Capitol Hill. Eleanor Holmes Norton is D.C.'s delegate.
It was devastating to the capital of the United States.
But if D.C. were a state, could that situation have been made better?
Infinitely better.
Norton can't vote in the House of Representatives, but she hopes her colleagues will. Last Congress, the House passed a bill for D.C. statehood, but it died in the GOP-led Senate.
This moment feels different for one reason and only one reason, and that is that Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the presidency.
But even that might not be enough. Advocates argue that to make D.C. the 51st state, it should require a simple majority, 51 votes. To do that, Democrats would need to nix the Senate filibuster, which isn't likely. And Republicans aren't budging on statehood.
They want to codify all this by making the swamp itself, Washington, D.C., America's 51st state. With 2 more liberal senators, we cannot undo the damage they've done.
Bringing D.C. into the congressional fold would alter the makeup of the Senate, likely adding 2 more blue seats to the body's already careful balance, and making D.C. the nation's 3rd smallest state. Still, proponents say now's the time.
D.C. statehood is literally the most pressing civil rights issue of our lifetime.
And not just for D.C. Some lawmakers are also renewing pushes for Puerto Rican statehood.
This is your city. I mean, what would it feel like if it were to pass, if it were to happen?
This is my state. And this is where I was born and raised. And what it would feel like, my voice and my vote matters, because right now it doesn't.
From city high-rises to suburban golf courses, investigators looking closely at Donald Trump's real estate empire, his taxes and financing. Trump Organization's CFO Alan Weisselberg, a key figure in the Manhattan District Attorney's investigation. Now Weisselberg's ex-daughter-in-law is speaking out in an NBC News exclusive, offering insights into Trump's top money man and the ongoing investigation. Here's NBC News investigative correspondent Tom Winter.
For 14 years until 2018, Jennifer Weisselberg was married to a son of Trump Organization Chief Financial Officer Alan Weisselberg.
Alan Weisselberg is defined by what Donald thinks about him, about saving him money regardless, every day, proving his worth by doing that creatively.
What do you think he could tell investigators?
Everything they would ask.
Do you think he could be the ultimate tour guide into the Trump orbit?
Yes.
She says she gained her own insights into the Trump orbit before her marriage to Barry Weisselberg ended in a bitter divorce. From visiting Trump's signature golf courses to her front row seat at the 2016 presidential inaugural, she says the Weisselberg family has been loyal to Donald Trump and he's been good to them. Her ex-husband Barry managing Trump's ice rinks in New York's Central Park. And she believed that in 2004, Trump and Melania gave them a big wedding gift, their own apartment overlooking the park. So you thought that the apartment you were living in was a gift. This is a congratulations.
I wrote them a thank you note.
And all along, it was just a corporate Trump Organization apartment.
I didn't understand these things. I was a ballet dancer. Come on.
In reality, Trump didn't give them the apartment. He let them live there rent-free, paying only for utilities, an arrangement that could raise legal and tax questions about how the Weisselbergs and the Trump Organization accounted for it. When the arrangement was reported last fall, it caught the attention of Manhattan District Attorney Cy Vance's office. The prosecutor, who went all the way to the Supreme Court and got Trump's tax returns, now in the thick of a grand jury investigation. How many times have you specifically talked with the Manhattan District Attorney's office?
Multiple times.
Okay.
And it's not over.
She declined to detail her conversations with investigators and is speaking out as her long and bitter divorce case is still playing out in court. She's already lost custody of her kids.
I have no reason to be here except that I am not a woman who is willing to live a life of secrecy out of fear any longer. They will out-resource me in the courts forever. And I have tried to be graceful, and I have tried to handle this privately. And they are not agreeing to do so at all. What choice do I have, Tom?
You want your kids back?
Yes. That's why I'm here.
There are going to be people that watch this and listen to you and hear the words that you say and are going to think this is somebody who is after their ex-husband, or this is somebody who has an axe to grind against a family. How do you respond to those people?
I can't care anymore what people think. I know who I am. My kids know who I am. People that love me know who I am, and I'm absolutely wish that I personally didn't have the attachment to somebody that has the same ethics as the Trump-Weisselberg family.
Jennifer says there's good reason prosecutors are so interested in what her former father-in-law knows.
Alan would not take an hour or day off if Donald was in the office because I think he felt like he had to be there all the time, but also they are a team. His office is right next door. He discusses everything with him.
Attorneys for Alan Weisselberg had no comment. Now, Vance's office is plowing through several million pages of Trump's financial documents, the vast majority of those filings overseen by Alan Weisselberg. It could be months before prosecutors determine whether charges should be filed.
6 women of Asian descent killed in Georgia on Tuesday, capping off a year of heightened hate crimes against Asian Americans. So how do we stop the violence and the hate? We can start by talking about it. Emmy award-winning talk show host of The Real, Jeannie Mai, has been using her platform to draw attention to the wave of anti-Asian violence and racism over the past year. Jeannie, we are so thrilled to have you on NBC News now today. Thank you for being with us. You have said you are not surprised by what... Oh, it's our pleasure. You have said you're not surprised by what happened in Atlanta, writing in an Instagram post, "America, we saw this coming. When people say they need help, believe them." We heard something very similar in Congress yesterday, lawmakers saying they were devastated, but sadly they were not surprised. So, Jeannie, tell us, what signs has America, what have we been missing here?
Well, first off, this isn't just a trend that started in the last few months. This is something that it's dated back not only just for centuries that we've dealt with racial stereotypes and racist innuendos and crime, but particularly in this past year, especially after we had a president in office that was spewing rhetoric that was very irresponsible. Anytime you direct a worldwide blame onto one race by calling it the Kung flu or the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus, you're directing these words into action. You're directing these emotions of anger and confusion towards an entire race. And the truth is, racist people don't understand that not everybody is Chinese. You look at one person, you target them, and if they somewhat look Asian, then you immediately go and you attack. So ever since this rhetoric has been spoken about, we as Asian Americans have brought this up many times, pleading with people to stop this type of language, and it's never happened. And we should not be surprised that when you speak words of hate, it will eventually turn into violence.
Jeannie, you've spoken about racist incidents that you have encountered before. Would you share some of your own personal experiences with us? Because I think it's so important for people to understand that when we talk about this, these aren't just statistics. These aren't just numbers. These are real experiences, things that are happening to people we know, people we love, our fellow American citizens. And I think it's really important that we hear what's going on.
Absolutely. I grew up Vietnamese, Chinese, American, born in the Bay Area. And back then, now I realize I really normalized a lot of forms of racism early on. I remember walking into my grade school and the first things I would hear is all the kids chanting, "Chinese, Japanese, dirty knees, look at these." And it came with the dance. It came with a pull up your eyes for Chinese, pull it across for Japanese, point it in your knees and grab your chest at the end. And now, as I've grown older, I realize that these stereotypes followed me because, I mean, the slanting of the eyes mocked us through caricature. Dirty knees indicated that Asian people were dirty or that we are people that are in the position of being on our knees all the time. And grabbing your breasts is alluding to promiscuity. So stereotypes followed me my entire childhood. I grew up in a 3-bedroom home with 15 people because my mother and father, who are both people, sponsored 10 of my family members over because they couldn't make the escape. And it was a proud time indoors because of my culture and the amazing aromas of our different foods in the kitchen and teaching my grandmother and my aunts how to speak English and get their citizenship. But outside of those 4 walls, we were mocked for being weird or smelly or dirty or, having a language barrier meant that my aunts and my grandmothers couldn't stand up for themselves. So, it just really is important to realize that today I'm starting to heal with my community by speaking out about our silence. Mm-hmm. My culture has normalized racism. They have normalized remaining silent. And this is the greatest problem as we continue to be ignored and underreported. Facts. That's why you haven't heard of this. And all of a sudden, we are surprised that this is happening. And that enrages me. And we as Asian Americans will continue to stand up for other people of color when we amplify standing up and fighting for ourselves.
Jeannie, it's hearing you tell this story. You started recounting that song, and all of a sudden I realized, oh, yeah, I heard people singing that as a kid when I was growing up. I didn't think about it until you said it now. But yeah, I remember as a kid, that was something kids would do in summer camp and maybe not even realizing how hurtful and horrible it was. It is so important that we have these conversations and realize just how much we have not been addressing this. I really can't thank you enough. I have a colleague, Kimmy Yam, she works here at NBC, and she spoke to some experts, and they told her that racism and sexism really need to be considered in this case in Atlanta. And they referenced the historic fetishizing of Asian women in the U.S. You touched on this a little bit, but your thoughts on the importance of not letting this go in this case in Atlanta, and also how we can all get involved and help fix this problem, this history of fetishism here in the U.S.
Absolutely. You nailed it on the head. Racism, sexism must be considered in this Atlanta shooting involving killing of 6 Asian women. The fact is, America has a legacy of creating and reinforcing stereotypes because hypersexualized narratives have existed about Asian women since they first arrived in this country during the gold rush. And sexual objectification very often leads to violence. In fact, a 2016 report by the National Network to End Domestic Violence found that 41 to 64% of Asian women reported experiencing physical and or sexual violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime, a higher rate than any other ethnic group. And one study even found that young East Asian women are overrepresented in rape and pornography. You look at Hollywood and these stereotypes are perpetuated on a daily basis. Most of the roles that Asian women play is some type of a provocative role, some type of a sideline person that has to do with something that's sexualized in some way. We've seen this in Austin Powers. We see this today in a lot of anime. So this is something Hollywood has a big responsibility to stop. And we as Americans have to begin to see Asian Americans in the light that we really are.
Jeannie, we can't bring back the 8 lives we lost in the Atlanta area on Tuesday, but we certainly can work to try to prevent other families from going through such a horrific loss. We can be better allies to our fellow Asian Americans. We can fight racism and hate. What would you like to see? What kinds of changes, big or even really small, do you think would help our country start moving in the right direction? I know that we have viewers who are probably watching this thinking, what can I do? How can I be better? Where can I start?
Absolutely. Now, there's amazing resources. If you go to GoFundMe and look up Stop Asian Hate, there's an amazing fund that's ongoing to help protect these families and supply these grassroots organizations that are helping to rebuild their communities. But I say to each individual who's listening to this, it is no longer enough to say, I'm not racist. We need to actively be anti-racist. And that's actually harder. To be anti-racist, it means that you need to look at your everyday routine and look at your communities and your own families and eliminate even some of the things that have brought us joy as children so the next generation can be healthier and stronger. Be mindful about your communication. Be mindful about your community and your influence. Every one of us have influence. It starts in the home, but it first starts in your mind.
Such great advice and such an important thing you said. It's not enough to just say, I'm not racist, right? You might not be doing anything wrong, but are you doing anything to help? It's so important. Jeannie, we were so glad that you joined us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
What's it like to ride in a self-driving taxi? Waymo's been testing the technology in Chandler, Arizona for years now and invited NBC News correspondent Gotti Schwartz to take an exclusive first ride.
Hey there, Allison. All right, so this is Waymo. This is what it looks like in the back, the future of travel, possibly. It looks like your normal Uber, except for when you look at the front, there is no one behind the wheel. We're going 45 miles an hour right now. So how did we get here? Take a look. Looks like this is our ride.
It's hard to describe what it's like when you hail a car.
See us?
And it pulls up with no one behind the wheel.
Good morning, Gotti. This car is all yours with no one up front.
But in the middle of the suburban desert, the future has arrived.
Whoa. Heading to Costco Holes.
And along with it, what Waymo hopes is a pandemic selling point.
It's just me and the steering wheel here.
Not having to get into a car with a stranger. To accelerate confidence, increased sanitizing. Waymo is spraying, wiping, and after every ride, flushing their vehicles clean.
Within a few minutes, we actually recirculate over 99% of the air, and so that it's fresh and ready for the next rider.
And this isn't just some test drive. Every day, the Waymo fleet picks up real passengers in a 100 square mile area near Phoenix. Think Uber and Lyft, but with an invisible driver.
These aren't exactly your typical soccer mom vans here.
No, you may have noticed they have some sensors that you don't see every day out on the roads.
Those sensors are the eyes of what Waymo calls the Waymo Driver, a computer that uses 19 cameras, LiDAR, and radar to see what's happening 360 degrees around the car and up to 3 football fields away.
Wow. It flagged a person that's way over there.
It's always paying attention day and night, 360 degrees. It's never drunk. It's never tired. It's never texting.
This is an experience, and it requires a little bit of trust.
Which might be one of the biggest speed bumps Waymo faces. AAA's annual automated vehicle survey found only 14% of drivers would trust riding in a car that drives itself, with a larger number saying COVID would not influence their decision. But Waymo says this is all the culmination of over 20 billion miles of testing, saying computer simulations consistently show their cars making more life-saving maneuvers than human drivers.
Kind of the pickup.
And Chandler's mayor, whose city has acted as Waymo's test track for almost 4 years, is on board.
What makes you more nervous here in your city? Human drivers or some of these autonomous vehicles?
Oh, easily human drivers.
Really?
Beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Oh, look at it, change lanes.
But for some, it's a different kind of safety that matters most.
Wouldn't be for like COVID purposes. It would actually be more for like driving alone as a woman late at night, safety. Like that would be my go-to for it.
Waymo hoping to prove safety is its biggest selling point.
Okay, we're accelerating.
Even if no one's behind the wheel.
Pedal to the metal, Waymo.
And Allison, one of the big questions you ask yourself when you're sitting here buckled up watching no one drive this car is, has Waymo ever been in an accident before? And the answer is yes. The company says that they've been in accidents over the last couple of years. In fact, last year they released data from 21 months, and in those 21 months they had 18 accidents, but they say none of them resulted in major injuries, and they also say that the overwhelming majority of them were the fault of human drivers and human error, which means the other drivers out on the road. So again, they're hoping that safety and their track record is something that will offer people a little bit of comfort as they sit here and watch the cars drive themselves. Allison, back to you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.